from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien on the grain markets. He'll discuss the latest numbers on U.S. grain exports and why wheat sales remain sluggish. And Dan offers his advanced thoughts on the USDA's Prospective plantings report coming out next week. Then K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti will talk about determining the optimum seeding rate for corn, factoring in the expected growing conditions and the yield potential of the field. He's developed general guidelines on dryland and irrigated corn seeding rates for the various growing regions of Kansas for you producers to reference. And we'll hear again from K-State's Chip Redmond on the Kansas agricultural weather scene. All that is straight ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, and glad to have you along with us once more. As we talk grain markets now with Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Well, Dan, of course, in recent weeks, the markets have been taking cues from the situation in Ukraine. Maybe they're shifting their attention elsewhere, and prices have settled now some, have they not?
Yeah, it seems like when you look at May corn, May hard red winter wheat, May soybeans, that we had had a strong run up for corn, for instance, had ran up to about 775, 780, something like that early on when the conflict became apparent and in the news affecting all the ag markets. And since then, traded in a range of about 725 to about 760 thereabouts. So we ran way up to an area that reflected the worries of the market for overall supply demand for the world and what the Ukraine crop potential lack of availability would bring about. So right now, for that contract, as we said before, trading in a range of about 725 to about 750 thereabouts. Fair moves each day, but we're not seeing those initial moves of 50, 60 cents, limit moves that we'd seen in it as all this started out. Now for wheat, it really stands out that we had jumped up all the way to about $13. And again, that happened about 2 weeks ago. And then once we came off of that, we've settled into a range of about $10.25 to about $10.70 thereabouts. And again, that's quite a range to be just kind of knocking around in, but yet that's where we are, up and down until we get further news, I guess. And for soybeans, strong soybean run up also. Again, I had run up to a high of about 1760, 1765, something like that. Then the next year, so fell down all the way to 1575. But after those gyrations, after all that worry and euphoria and fear was all expressed, we've kind of settled into a range of about 1625 to about 1730, something like that. And they are actually trending up a little bit in the soybean market of late within that range. So interesting to look at. We've been concerned about where basis levels have gone, particularly for wheat in the early days of all that run up. We've talked last week, I believe, Eric, about what happened on March 7th, that Monday, and then how basis widened out so dramatically on the next day, the 8th, as it affected the willingness of people throughout that industry at different layers in the supply chain, as we say nowadays, to participate in cash markets, millers, and you name it. So it does look like after that initial, and looking at selected Kansas basis levels, that we had pretty sharp drops, anywhere from over $1 in some locations to 70, 80 cents thereabout. And so across the state, in the locations that we tracked, had strong drops. But then we have also at these same locations recovered now for 2 weeks in a row thereafter. Not near where we were before, but I guess it follows kind of our economic reasoning that yes, people can decide not to be in the market at any one time and say, hey, no more for now, but they still have needs. And now as they climb back into those markets and start to try to bring in inventory, i.e. the people beyond the farm gate, that basis started to improve. I wonder where it will end up at. Frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if we gain at least half or more of that back, just in more of a steady state, just because we'll need the grain. So going to be interesting to watch.
If we loop into this, what's happening on the export scene, Dan? We're selling feed grains pretty well. We're not selling wheat much at all, rather lethargic there, and soybean sales are somewhere in between.
Yeah, a good week for cash movement, for actual physical shipments of corn shipped for the week ending the 17th of March, 59 million bushels, and need a pace of about 54.5 to meet the USDA's projection. So if we maintain strong paces like that, then a month or so down the road, those USDA WASDE reports will reflect some tightening of stocks that, and again, they tightened 100 million bushels in the March report and went down to about 14.5, as I recall, but 14.5 billion bushels. Well, we take another 25, another 50, another 70 off of that because of strong corn sales. Well, then you get below 1.4 billion bushels and tighten things up, and it provides that much more support for the old crop corn market and more pressure on the new. And for grain sorghum, again, we've had such a up and down pattern in sorghum, but here within the last 2 weeks, we've been above 10 million bushels for both weeks, which is pretty strong for sorghum. And we need a pace of just over 7 to meet the USDA's projection of 310 million bushels. So something to watch. And you could see grain sorghum stocks tighten up as well. And you do see on the cash bid side some awfully strong bids. What just stands out so much, I think, is that Southwest Kansas bid for corn. Their cash bid, $7.93, a 44-cent over basis. And that's basically at least 60 cents better than any other of the places we watch it in different areas of the state. A new crop bid of 15 over in that part of the world. And the best basis bid otherwise is Hutchinson has a bid of 9 under, and then everything else is about 20, 21, 30 under. So pretty strong for corn. And for sorghum, even though out of Southwest Kansas, you wouldn't expect to see the strongest sorghum price necessarily because it's, they're more feed usage. Still, they have the strongest cash bid for sorghum at 738. In Colby, 734, and then everything else trailing behind. So just pretty strong out to the west in terms of grain bids. We have this ongoing conundrum in the wheat market where we have prospects for wheat buyers to come to the U.S. shores, and there are even headlines that Egypt is contacting the United States and other major exporters in an effort to compensate for their lost supplies, literally, or their bottled up supplies in the Black Sea region. So those things have the potential to come about, but they haven't done so yet. So we still are trading very optimistically based on what could happen, but so far that those actual export shipments haven't occurred yet. I would also say for soybeans, we're not that far from that South American harvest coming in, even though it's going to be less coming available and probably becoming predominant in world cash markets. Shipped about 20 million bushels in the week ending March 17th, need about 21 to meet the USDA's projection. So we are as we are, kind of moving along, very likely probably hit the USDA's pace. Again, we're 95% of the way there with only about 54% of the marketing year. So we'll probably get to what the USDA has projected. But, we're kind of in that mode where if the South American crop's coming on and people have things bought ahead, it's not beyond the actions in the past of buyers with sales to cancel if they think there are great deals down the road, if they can just wait a month or two. So we'll see how that goes.
The next market mover, in the absence of anything really breaking loose one way or the other in Ukraine, would be the USDA's Prospective Plantings Report. That's due out this coming Thursday, the 31st of March, and there are all kinds of speculations as to what those numbers might say, keeping in mind that survey was taken early in March. Your perceptions on what we might see from that report, Dan?
Well, my perceptions have been that I have wondered whether the strength in the corn market and it sounds like the general availability of fertilizer, even though it's very high priced, would lead us to plant more corn, and not necessarily at the expense of soybeans. One thing we heard in talking to a class this week at K-State is some of the youth who's talking about what their farm families are doing. They talked a lot about double cropping soybeans behind wheat, and actually increasing wheat acres, et cetera. So it's interesting to hear from the ground level what's going on. But in a farm futures survey just taken, farmers indicated they were planning on planting 90.3 million acres of corn the USDA had basically said they thought farmers this year would plant 92 million acres. So that's quite a difference from being down just under 3 million to the USDA's projection being down about 1.4. So we'll see where it all goes. And then for soybeans, out of that Farm Future Survey, a projection of 92.2 million acres planted by the farm audience that participated in that. The USDA had projected 88. So an increase of about 0.8 in the USDA's eyes, an increase of about 5 million according to these farmers. So if that ended up being the actual survey numbers that came out of this, that would cause a lot of volatility in the market. It'd be very supportive for corn. It would be somewhat negative for soybeans. I don't think anything could be terribly negative for soybeans in this environment, but a 5 million acre increase, 4.2 more than the USDA projected, that'd have an impact on the soybean market. So, the first thing you ask, well, is the Farm Future Survey valid? Well, it could be a self-selecting audience making these statements. And again, it's early. There's the intention of planting soybeans. If they're on a roll planting corn, they could plant more, et cetera. So we don't quite know where that will go. But at least as we stand right now, the only information we've got is this Farm Future Survey set of numbers. And it's not an official government report, et cetera, but it would be something very supportive for corn markets and would cause people to think twice about running higher yet on the soybean market.
Not sure how much more volatility these markets can endure, but we may have that very opportunity to find out again with the USDA Prospective Plantings Report due out this coming Thursday. And we'll hash over those numbers when we talk again next week. Dan, thank you, as always.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it.
He is Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. This is Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Here we are pushing into the latter stages of the month of March. That means that corn planting time will soon be here in the state of Kansas and in this region. Always a critical decision-making time as far as corn seeding rates and what should go into that decision. We'll talk about with Ignacio Ciampitti joining us. Ignacio is a cropping systems agronomist, K-State Research and Extension, as you know. Ignacio, this is something that you are very interested in studying of late, seeding rates that would be optimum for a growing situation, right?
Yeah, and as you know, corn is one of the, I would say, more demanded crops in terms of input. So if we think about what are the main input for the crop and the production cost, seeding rates, even the seed cost is one of the highest. This year also in competition, we have also on the picture fertilizer too. So I think that selecting inputs and taking the right decisions are critical.
Even more so than we normally would say. But seeding rates are always imperative nonetheless.
It has been a lot of research on seeding rate, and we have been doing research on seeding rate for the last close to 9 years, and still we are seeing that things are evolving. And then what in the past we were looking at just trying to get a sense of what are the optimum and looking at the maximizing yields, these concepts start changing very quickly, very fast, to start looking at maximizing profits and what is economic optimum, not just a maximum for agronomy and productivity, but really to make some profit. And then we are moving also now into the point of start thinking about how we start using some of the tools that we have at hand, like weather station, current soil moisture, and looking at the projection of the forecast to start taking decisions on seeding rates.
One thing we can start with is reflecting back on last year's corn production and the conditions that existed then as well, but just what sort of ear set one was experiencing then, and that could be an indicator of seeding rate.
Yeah, and in fact, we have an article that is in the Agronomy e-update, and the article is very timely because this decision will be the one that I need to take in the next coming weeks. What is the final seeding rate? And if you think about what was experienced from last year, some of the learnings that we can take from 2021, if you go to your fields and if you are looking at years, so if you have fewer kernels per year, or if you have plants that were barren, that means that most likely you were not in the right seeding rate. I mean, we have also the situation that we have, in many cases, too many kernels per year. So that means that you probably were into a low population. So you have large ear sizes, but you didn't maximize the amount of plants in the canopy.
So you could have raised the seeding rate there.
Exactly. So, and then we have the situation which is the opposite effect. So for excess, which is if you have, a lot of abortion. So if you look at the ear size and you have the tip back, but rather than having just a few kernels missing, if you have 10% or more of that ear that is already aborted, that means that you probably went too high on the population side, so on the seeding rate. It's a very kind of a complex challenge when deciding the seeding rate, similar to when we are deciding fertilizers and the nitrogen fertilization for corn, more because we tend to use this information from last year. The years usually don't repeat. And even in the best case scenario, we tend to use an average of several years on the back. And then the last couple of years after 2012, we have been in some weather situations that they have been a little bit more favorable for corn production. So we are kind of on the sweet spot thinking, okay, everything works well, so I can always try to find ways of pushing population. But the situation that we're experiencing today with the weather, it kind of give us a reminder that we're in a dry spot, so we need to really rethink about our strategies and make sure that we think about what is the optimal seeding rate.
But we think about crop inputs here once again beyond the seed itself, and you mentioned the fertility rate one's going to go with based on how much they want to pay for nitrogen fertilizer, for instance, and the irrigation rates for those who are watering the crop and how far they'll go. One should work those into the equation too.
Yeah, you need to because, for example, even if we keep digging on the seeding rates, when you look at the map for the state level, so your seeding rates usually are connected to the productivity. So based on what type of attainable yields you have in different regions of the state, that seeding rate is very well tied to that. So if you are in a northeast Kansas where you are able to get high yields, your seeding rate will most likely be high. If you start moving into western Kansas without irrigation, working on dryland systems, you have lower yield expectations, your seeding rates will go in the low end. And then when you think about fertility, and specifically the nitrogen fertilization, which is a big topic for 2022, if you are in a high productive system, we know that corn is very sensitive to nitrogen deficiency. So unless you put some nitrogen, you will be limiting the crop. And then if we are in western Kansas, we know that if we are in dryland systems, we have a limit on the yield productivity. So we need to really start thinking about how we are tying together the seeding rates and this nitrogen fertilization, because today they are the key input for corn production for 2022.
So many variables to work with here. We would note that in this article in the E-Update newsletter out that you have come up with some pretty handy charts for the state of Kansas, region by region, on suggested final populations and seeding rates for both dryland and irrigated corn.
Yeah, and perfect. The distinction between seeding rate and plant population, we will make that distinction. You will always find that seeding rates is usually a little bit higher than plant population. So seeding rate is your target number of seeds that you plant in the field, and your plant population is the final number of plants that you achieve. And usually you will see that depending on the conditions, it could be between 90, 95%, or it could be even lower if you were in a planting scenario that was not good, or for problems of cold temperature when you went too early, or excess of water if you went also too early and you have a lot of rains. Or you could go to the other side if you start planting a little bit later, that you have heat stress in some situations or you have dry conditions. So depending on the situations, that number of plants that you attain is slightly lower usually. It could be like 5% below the target, or it could be some situations, 20, 25% below the target. We want to keep these two factors, the seeding rate and the plant population, as close as possible to make sure that whatever is the separation between these two is making you to pay more, because you have basically plants and seeds that you put on the ground that they were not converting to plants. And it's money that just slip away. And then if you look at the map for the state level, you will find that we put different scenarios for northeast, southeast, north central, south central, northwest, and southwest. And then there are situations that you are changing your seeding rate based on productivity. If you are irrigated, it's usually higher than dryland. As we move to the west, we have less precipitation. So if we are working on dryland systems, our seeding rates usually go down. And we have a very handy information on one of the research that we have done in the past. What we did is that we look at multiple environments, multiple studies across the state, and we try to develop some kind of more kind of guidelines. What happens when you are in lower yielding environments? So if a farmer is in less than 100 bushel environments, usually that tends to be very, very low. We were looking at increasing seeding rates was not a factor helping the farmers. So when we were putting less than 20,000, in some situations 18, or if you think about in dryland, western Kansas, in some places around 15,000 seeds per acre, is excellent because adding more plants, you are creating more stress. So you are not helping the crop. Moving from western to the central part, you will start seeing that you can start adding more plants, you have more rain. So you move from maybe 100 bushel environments to 150, and then we can start increasing seeding rates. And then in most of these central Kansas environments, we usually are between 20 or 24,000 seeds per acre. And then when you start moving into much better environments like East Central Kansas, you start getting into 180s, 200 bushels. In those scenarios, you start pushing 28,000, really close to getting to 30,000. And then if you really go to very high yielding environments, closer to 200 plus, 250 plus bushels per acre, then you are moving into the 30,000 seeds per acre. So you are really seeing that in many situations, the evolution of the seeding rate increases as you have more availability of water, as you have more precipitation. So you are adding more plants.
Your objective here again is for the optimum rate, not maximum.
Not
They're not one and the same.
Not maximum, because sometimes, for example, the maximum will tell us to go ahead and put 2,000 or 3,000 more seeds, but we are increasing yields only in 3 or 4 bushels. And when you start making the math on the cost of the seeds and the number of bushels, then you start looking at those numbers and you say, okay, I'd rather stay on the optimum and closer to the maximum, but I don't need to be exactly on the maximum because if not, I'm taking a higher risk.
In the meantime, you have this article in the most recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter just out yesterday, right off the press, and it covers optimum seeding rate decisions. Have a look at that, producers, at agronomy.ksu.edu under the E-Update tab there. Great stuff. Ignacio, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for the invitation, as always.
Ignacio Ciampitti, Cropping Systems Agronomist with K-State Research and Extension, on seeding rate decisions for this upcoming corn production season. We'll be back on Agriculture Today. Coming your way next on this Agriculture Today, the very latest out of the Weather Data Library at K-State on Kansas agricultural weather. Joining us once more, meteorologist, K-State Research and Extension, Chip Redmond. We can look back on this past, week plus with very generous rains in a lot of locations around Kansas, sorely needed.
Yeah, central and eastern Kansas really benefited with as much as 1 to 2 to almost 3 inches of rain in places. We even saw some creeks approaching flood stage in the southern Flint Hills. Unfortunately, the western part of the state really continues to miss out. The far northwest got lucky with about a half inch of moisture, but from basically, about Norton County to Decatur County southward into the southwest, they got a tenth of an inch if they were lucky, maybe 2/10 of an inch in places. So most of the state benefited greatly, but there's still attention needed for western Kansas.
Well, that will be an ongoing saga for some time. But did we see some easing of the drought monitor in those areas that have seen moisture in the last 10 days or so?
Yeah, with 2 to 3 inches for the week, we saw drought improvements, mostly focused in central and in eastern Kansas. We saw abnormally dry significantly be reduced in the Flint Hills, as well as improvements in severe drought in central Kansas this week.
It's been, of late, cloudy and cool along with the moisture. Chip, wanted to ask you this week about where our soil temperatures are reading at the moment, because we're, well, of course, concerned about the wheat crop, but ever so closer to spring planting, too.
Yeah, with the wheat crop, our growing degree units for the year, we're running pretty well above average going into the middle of March. But here over the last week, we've come back down to about average with really no accumulation with these cooler temperatures and overcast days. What that has done, too, is help reduce the soil temperatures some. We're still seeing some averages, 7-day averages of around 50 degrees in the far southeast. And I know some folks are really thinking they're going to be planting here within the next week or two. But as we get outside that far southeast, we're mostly mid-40s to even some low 40s in the northwest. So not quite there for most of the state.
But a few sunny and warmer days will lend to that. As for the forecast, then, Chip, looks like we're in for a stretch of drier weather and warming temperatures and maybe a spotty chance of more moisture.
Yeah, the forecast through the weekend and into early next week is very warm. We're going to see 90 degrees, potentially higher in the southwest, starting as early as Sunday and continuing into Tuesday. Warm and windy conditions as well, so that's going to lend to fire weather concerns are going to really, really uptick on Monday and Tuesday. Beyond that, we do have a chance of precipitation there midweek next week. We'll have a pretty strong storm system come through. Looks like there could be some potential for rain, especially in eastern Kansas, maybe even some thunderstorms, perhaps of the severe variety. That it's been a pretty quiet, severe weather season so far. That looks like it'll probably uptick a little bit. But beyond that, the pattern is cool conditions to bring in April, not significantly below average, but much more closer to average to slightly below average. So this warm spell will be short-lived with a return to seasonal conditions to bring in the start of April. The Climate Prediction Center is hinting at above normal precipitation into early April. It's going to take a pretty significant pattern change to bring in as much moisture as we saw last week. But precipitation chances are there. I think we'll get some normal to above normal, maybe in some very isolated areas. But once again, that'll be mostly focused in eastern Kansas.
Chip, as always, thanks. Next Friday, we'll visit once more and get caught up on the latest Kansas agricultural weather developments. Appreciate your time.
Yep, thank you.
Chip Redmond, meteorologist, K-State Research and Extension. Our time's away once more. Thanks for listening in, and a good weekend to you. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.